everyone. Welcome to the June Avenues to Wellness talk. And we're really glad that you could be here. Tonight we're very pleased to have Jed Diamond here. Jed's been working to help men and the families who love them for more than 40 years. And he's the author of 12 books, translated into many, many languages, including the international bestseller Male Menopause, Surviving Male Menopause, and The Irritable Male Syndrome. And we're really excited because Jed has 2 new books out this year. One is Stress Relief for Men, and that he'll be speaking about some of that tonight, using tools of energy to live well. And also his first children's book. And it's for all ages, actually, and it's on the subject of composting Abby, a whale of a story. I'm sure most of you have heard about that. And tonight Jed will be sharing his wisdom about why sex matters, which I guess it does, and the field of gender-specific medicine. So welcome, Jed.
Thank you. So I was coming over to the gathering a half hour ago. I passed the voting booth, and people were saying, y'all have voted. And somebody asked me about the talk today and about sex, why sex matters. He wanted to know if I was using sex as a verb or a noun. And I said, well, whatever you would like. We'll have some of both. So before I talk to you, the real core of this is work that I've been doing, and research has been going on for some time, that really I think is important to help us all understand how to live more healthy lives, which is what this whole series is about. For me, the focus on men's health comes from a couple of places. I'm a guy, and so, from the time I was a little guy, I was interested in myself and my health and guy things. But 2 kind of events really still guide my work. The first one occurred with my father, the second one with my son. So my father, like me, was a writer, and he was very creative, and he spent a lot of his life dealing with depression, as I have. And there was a point in his life where things were really difficult. The economy was difficult. He was not able to work in the field that he was working in. He wasn't selling any plays, and he wasn't selling any poetry, and he got very discouraged. And the thought of raising a child for him as a man who in his mind was not successful, he was not able to be a good provider. And that was stressful enough for him that at some point he decided he could not continue living. And he tried to take his own life. And he didn't die physically, but our lives were never the same again. I was 5 years old. And from that time, I wanted to know what happened to my father, right? And what happens to, what gets anybody to a place where they don't want to live anymore? And what had happened to me? And when I grew up, how would I deal with my own children? So when my son, Jamal, was born, if you can picture this, you can picture this back a few years ago, where there was question about whether they would allow fathers to be in the delivery room, because you never knew what a father was going to do. I mean, he might do something crazy. He might pass out. He might go, I don't know what. But I was told, you might not be able to be in the delivery room. All right. So I'm a good Jewish boy that I am. I follow the rules. So after 12 hours of labor with my wife doing Lamaze childbirth breathing, and I was coaching, and she was, going through her things, they finally was ready for her to go into the delivery room, and they said, oh, Mr. Diamond, you need to now wait in the waiting room. So I started walking out to the waiting room, and I got to the waiting room door, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't go out to the waiting room. I felt like there was somebody calling to me to not be a waiting room father. And so I turned back around, I went back in to the delivery room, pushed myself through the doors, and took my place.
That's why they don't let fathers in.
That's why they don't let fathers in. Crazy stuff like that. And so it wasn't long after before my son Jamal was born, and they handed him to me. And, you know, I was crying, and everybody was crying. And I made a vow to him when I held him, because I really felt it was his presence that was calling me back. And I made a vow that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me. And that I would do everything I could to make a different kind of world where fathers were connected to their children, where they didn't wait in waiting rooms, where they were fully involved, and mothers and children and families were, you know, bonded. So that's really kind of the impetus of the work that I do. There are 3 realities about men's health that I want to just give you as a preface to 10 specific big ideas that I think are important. But here are the 3 important realities that kind of drive my work every day. The first is that we know now that men die of all kinds of things a lot sooner than women. And that if we could do simply, you know, not a huge change in our health care, but if we could simply get the death rate for guys down to the same place where it is for women, we would save about 375,000 men's lives every year in the United States alone. Point number 1. Point number 2, research from the University of Michigan, who did this study on worldwide men's health, said secondly that his view was that if we could do that, simply get men and women to live the same amount of time, that we would do more good in curing cancer. I think that's a worthy goal. And the third is that we know now that 80 to 90% of all illnesses are stress related. So all the, those 3 things are what make me go, yeah, avenues to wellness, we can do something. And if we can do something for men, it's going to be good for women. If we can do something for our relationships and with our families, we do something good for all of us. So I presume you're all here because you share some of that desire with me to make things better for men and the people that love them. Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. So here's 10 big ideas that I'm going to go through pretty quickly, and I want to have time where we can talk and answer questions. So the first one is, think of this, there are about 10 trillion cells in the human body. 10 trillion cells. And every one of them is sex specific. Think of that. Every cell in your body is sex specific. And we know, just quick biology, right, that if you are a female, raise your hand if you're a female. Okay, we've got the females room. So we know that the way you got to be a female was that there was an egg that had an X chromosome and a sperm that was carrying an X chromosome. And when it came together, you got an X and an X, and those were the women. And we know that guys, started with an X egg, that was, and a sperm that was a Y sperm, and we got an XY. Everybody knows that, but here's what has recently been known, is that that difference makes a difference in ways that we're just now beginning to understand. And often poets understand things a lot sooner than scientists. Have you noticed that? And the poet Robert Bly is a friend, colleague, interesting man. He was talking about the importance of older men in the lives of younger men. And he said that younger men need to be with older men so that they can hear the sound that male cells sing. Think about that. That there are male cells that all us guys have, and they sing a certain song, and they vibrate at a certain frequency. And that the females have also a song that females sing that vibrate at a certain frequency, and then we've all got our individual songs. So that's number one. Okay, number two. It's been an accepted fact for a long time in genetic research that human beings are about 99.9% the same. So whether we're dealing with people from Africa, people from Europe, people from South America, that the view has been that genetically we're 99.9% the same. Well, it turns out this isn't true. And there's been fairly new research from a laboratory at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, from a guy named Dr. David Page, who's been doing genetic research. And what he's found is that it's true that we are 99.9% the same if you compare two men. All us guys, right? You and me, 99.9% the same. Keith and I, 99.9. And if you compare two women, you're 99.9% the same genetically. However, if you compare the genetics of a man and a woman, we're only 98.5% the same. I mean, think of that. And he concludes, so 0.1% compared to 1.5% difference is 15 times more different. Well, you think, just, 1.5%, how different? Well, here's how different it is. We all share about 98.5% genetically with chimpanzees. So we're quite a lot like chimpanzees, but we're about as different from chimpanzees genetically as I am from my wife, Carla. Now, it turns out that that difference really makes a difference. They're starting to find out in his lab that the genes code proteins, all the stuff I've talked about, Diane's talked about how that, makes for our bodies, makes for our minds. They code differently if you're a female or a male. And we've had this belief in medicine for a long time that the only difference is in they call it bikini medicine. There's a difference if you're talking genitals or breasts, but outside of that, it's been assumed that we're the same. Well, we're not. That's what they find. So men and women, number three, are not equal, at least in this way. And I'll quote David Page. This is the MIT professor who's been doing this genetic research. He says, we've had a unisex vision of the human genome. Men and women, however, are not equal in our genome, and men and women are not equal in the face of disease. So, fourth big idea that I want to... We know that heart disease, as an example, is different in males and females. And the symptoms for a heart attack, which we've assumed for a long time in medicine, is the same. We've got hearts, we've got the same kind of heart, so it's been assumed that the symptoms of a heart attack, that pressure in the chest and the radiating pain down the arm, is true for everybody. But it turns out that that's a symptom that's more common in males. And that females, they've done studies now, that show that female heart attack symptoms are different. Often, not always. Some women get that crushing chest pain radiating down the arm, but often they get nausea. They get, a feeling of lightheadedness and sickness. And this is from Dr. Marion J. Legato. She's an MD, and she was one of the first people, she's a cardiologist, and she was looking at female heart attack victims. And this is what she says. It says, everywhere we look, the two sexes are startlingly and unexpectedly different, not only in their internal function, but the way they experience illness. So again, crashing pain for men. Women more often will have fleeting pain in the upper abdomen, shortness of breath, and sweating. So what happens for years, women would go to emergency rooms or, to see doctors with those, symptoms. Shortness of breath, nausea, lightheadedness, pain in the upper abdomen, and you can imagine what kind of treatment they got. Some it was, well, go home, doesn't sound like anything serious. For some, antacids. For some, the lucky ones went, hey, maybe we better look more fully. So that's an example of what we're beginning to recognize of gender-specific medicine. We need to pay attention to those differences. Now you can imagine, given my father's experience and some of my experience in the people, that depression is something I have an interest in. Well, the assumption has been, it's kind of the mirror image of heart attacks. It's been assumed because men get heart attacks earlier than women, we've tended to view heart disease through a male lens. Well, we've assumed the similar reverse thing for depression. That it's been assumed that women experience depression about twice as often as males generally. And that's been a worldwide assumption. There have been studies going on. But how do you know if somebody's depressed? You don't do a blood test. You don't have an x-ray. You ask questions and you talk about certain symptoms. Well, what I discovered in my own life, because I have dealt with depression for most of my life, is that the symptoms of depression for me are very different than the symptoms for many women. For instance, we know that if you go to a doctor or you go to a psychotherapist and they do a depression questionnaire, you'll have questions like sadness, sleeping more or not sleeping well, a whole series of things that will then either define you as you got a possible depression or you don't. Well, it turns out that I had symptoms like irritability, anger, frustration, in my case not, but many men drinking alcohol, escaping, and the view was that that's not depression, that's something else. And so now again, back to the suicide rates. If you're not asking the right questions, if you're not recognizing that the same way in which we looked at depression through a unisex lens and said, well, geez, you got anger, irritability, these things, that doesn't sound like depression to me. You have men that don't get treated, and in the case of my father and many other men, he tried to commit suicide, nobody recognized the early signs. Many men die before their time. How many men? Listen to this. We know that there's a general kind of rule of thumb that says that the suicide rate in males is 4 times higher than females. That's high. I mean, it's the highest discrepancy of any disease between men and women. Suicide is the highest risk for any difference between men and women. But listen to this, is that the suicide rate starts going up as men hit retirement age. Doesn't go up for women. So 4 times generally, men in their 60s, the suicide rate is 6 times higher for men than it is for women in their 60s. And men in their 70s, 7 times higher than for women in their 70s. And men 85 and older, which is the fastest growing demographic, we're all getting older and many of us are living. The suicide rate for males 85 and older is 18 times higher than it is for females. I mean, that does something to me when I hear that. I feel that in my bones. I see it in my friends. I see it in men as they get older who, are dealing with depression and either don't know it isn't recognized, it isn't treated. So, that's number 5, depression. In my book, they said I always ought to talk about my book. I have actually a number of books that deal with this issue because it's obviously one that's close to my heart. The new book, Stress Relief for Men, talks in depth about my father's journey, my journey with depression, and men's journey and the women that are in contact with us and how we can better deal with that. So, number 6, men live sicker and die sooner than women. live sicker, and die sooner. And I've talked to a lot of men in my practice and my friends say, oh man, you know, it doesn't matter if I die a few years earlier. We know that the death rate for men is four times to 5 times, or 4 to 5 years sooner than it is for women. Women live 4 to 5 years longer. That's changed. It's dropped. It used to be 7. The reason it's dropped isn't because men are living longer. It's because women are dying sooner, as women are, you know, having some of the same diseases and problems that men have. So the discrepancy is less, but not because we're living better, right? You get that. So what we know is that if you, and men, listen up when I say this, it's bad enough that we die sooner, but you know, when you're dead, who cares? You're gone. I mean, for you don't have to worry about anything. But the thing that most of us pay attention to is we don't want to live sicker. We don't want to spend the last 5, 10, 15 years of our life debilitated and sick, right? So, for all 15 leading causes of death, so it started heart disease, cancer, all the way down the list, and statistically men die sooner and live sicker for everyone except Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, women seem to, but every one of the other ones, 14 out of the 15 men die sooner and live sicker. It's number 6. Number 7. So, back to my introduction. If we could simply get the death rates and just the health rates, right? I mean, if we could just have audiences that were equally men and women coming to all the health events that go on in the community. If you had guys taking as good care of themselves and their diets and all the other things as women did, I mean, just think what a better world it would be. You know, think of your friends. Think how many people have lost men or men that have gotten sick. Not to say that women don't too. I absolutely know. Women get sick, women die, women suicide, absolutely. And we need to pay attention to everything. But wouldn't it be wonderful if we could make everybody healthier? That's my goal. So number 8. Biomedical research in general and neuroscience in particular has been built on a false assumption, which is, in the broad sense, that there are no significant differences between males and females. But here's some science and some practical science that's coming out that, to me, is mind-blowing. Because many of us are not suffering from those big illnesses yet, hopefully. Some of us are, right? We know that. But many of us have trouble sleeping. Am I the only one that has ever had trouble sleeping? No. Am I the only one that has taken a sleeping medication to help me sleep? No. So here's what we know about a specific sleep drug. There's a sleep drug called Ambien. Y'all know about Ambien? Some of you probably take it or have taken it or know somebody that's taken it. Well, Ambien has been on the market for about 20 years. And during that whole 20 years, if you went to a doctor and you got a prescription of Ambien for sleep, the same dosage would be given if you were a male or female. If you go to the doctor for any medication, am I right? You don't get a dose that says, oh, you're a woman, you ought to get this dose. You're a man, you ought to get that dose. Right? Doesn't happen. But they finally, somebody noticed that many women, the day after they took the medication and then were up driving their kids to school, were still kind of sleepy. So somebody finds that maybe we ought to test to see how much Ambien is still in the bloodstream of women the next morning. Right? I mean, it seemed like it would be something you should have done 20 years ago, but it wasn't. And listen to this. This is a mind blower. They found that women the next day, obviously there's some difference between different women. Sizes make a difference if you're smaller or bigger, but across the board, women as a group had 45% higher levels in their bloodstream of Ambien the next morning than the men.
Body doesn't process it out.
Doesn't process it in the same way. So in a sense, what we've been doing for 20 years is overdosing women on a very common sleep medication. And they've begun studying now when they do drug trials, they now are looking at male-female. You got to have women in the trials as well as men. But they're not taking the data and looking at it separately. So what they do is they average the data. So what does that mean in the case of most medications that you're taking? Chances are women for these, we don't know. You say, well, are there other medications that women are taking too much of? We don't know. They've just done it, this was since I did my thing, Lunesta, it's another sleep. They're finding a similar thing in Lunesta. But as far as I know, maybe they've changed the formularies for Lunesta and Ambien, but how many other drugs are you taking? And are you taking too much? Are you taking too little? In the case of Ambien, if they average the data, it may be that men aren't getting enough. So men, are still not sleeping very well, and they think, oh, maybe I ought to take 2. Or they think it isn't working. I'm not sleeping, and if you haven't slept and you're taking meds and you're still not sleeping, you get cranky, you get angry. So that's point number 8. All right, point number 9. It wouldn't surprise you, but I think you'll be surprised at the specifics that male and female brains are different. I mean, we all kind of guess that, but listen to this. Here's some specifics. This comes from the lab of Luann Brizendine. She's an MD at UC San Francisco, and she has a lab. Mostly, it's interesting, most of the gender-specific medicine that we've been afraid to look at because of a lot of fears of, we got to be gender correct. We don't want women to be different than men, because it's true. In the past, gender differences have been used to keep women at home. Well, women are too they can't, or they shouldn't do this, or they can't do that. Well, now many women in the field are leading the way to look at gender differences, and there's a whole field of gender-specific medicine. Luann Brizendine is one of the people. So here's just a few of the brain differences that come out of Brizendine's lab. And don't worry about the names of the brain things. If you're really interested, you can read the book and you can get why the anterior cingulate cortex. But just trust me, it weighs options and makes decisions. It's the worrywart center. And would it surprise you that it's larger in women than in men? Women tend, right, as a group, to worry more, to ruminate more, there's a reason. I mean, there's lots of reasons. But one reason is you got a brain structure that is a center that is larger.
Is that the right prefrontal cortex area?
Well, it's the anterior cingulate cortex, so it's a part of that. This is even more specific area. Number 2. The medial preoptic area is the area for sexual pursuit. Need I say, 2.5 times larger in males. Would that surprise you?
No.
But how many of us knew that? That there's an actual specific area in the brain, rather than those cartoons that just say men, sexual, that they got 10 areas in their brain. Well, they actually have an area, it's bigger than that area.
And does it do any good?
Well, we don't know. We'll check it out. So number 3, the temporal parietal junction is the solution seeker. It's more active in the male brain, comes online more quickly, and races towards a fix-it-fast solution. So how many guys do you know that when you come and you want to talk about a problem, you just want to talk, he wants to fix it?
Yeah.
Right? Well, here, you can't even get out of your mouth what the problem is, and he's already got a solution. And all of us, guys, have that tendency. Doesn't mean we all do it, but we have that tendency because we've got that particular brain structure. Number 4, and this is one that I got to tell you, it's been a source of pain and suffering in my home for a long time. The hippocampus, it's a center for emotional memory. And she describes it as the elephant that never forgets. And would it surprise you that women have a greater tendency to remember things, pretty emotionally sensitive things, and men don't so much.
Why do you say that?
Yeah, so here's This area, the hippocampus is larger and more active in women. So this area that called the hippocampus in the brain is more active and larger in women. And so it shows up in my family in things like this. Like, I do the dishes in my family, okay? And after you do the dishes, we have a rule, you put them away where they go. Well, for most of our married life, after I do the dishes, I have no idea where to put certain things. Because I just don't remember where that pot goes. Carlin has never been able to understand, well, why don't you just put it where you got it? Well, because I forgot where I got it. So I try to pretend like it's still wet. I didn't put it away because I didn't dry it. And really, I find I have to say, I just don't remember. She, on the other hand, and this has been a source of pain, remembers 20 years later something that I did, a small little indiscretion, I might say.
The forks in the wrong slot.
Yeah, but something I did, 20 years, she still remembers it and reminds me. Well, hippocampus. So it actually, and it was kind of the title of my little talk, she wrote a book. Dr. Legato, who was the woman that did the heart research, she wrote a book on differences between men and women, and she wrote a book called Why Men Never Remember and Women Never Forget. And there's a whole bunch of things in there that make sense. And the reason, so this is number 10. Finally, and then we're going to have time for questions, and I wanted to have some time where we can talk. You can ask me stuff, or you can comment, whatever. So the kind of conclusion that I draw is a couple of things. One is that differences make a difference, and they're great, right? I mean, it's so wonderful that we have, female-type people on the planet and male-type people on the planet. And I think a lot of the conflict that most of us have in our male-female relationships, our love life, our friend life, our work life, in many ways is because we don't understand that there are these differences. And if you don't know that, Carlin assumes that if I don't put the thing away, I must not care, I must, be out to lunch, why can't I remember things? And I think, why can't she ever forgive me for that thing I did 20 years ago? I mean, and you get crazy, like, come on, 20 years ago, I don't even remember that. So you get the idea, right? So I think if we recognize, and to me this is some of the most interesting, because, male, female, there's hardly anything in my world that's more interesting to me than men and women. In my practice as a therapist, in my life as a man, in my, as most of you know, Carlin and I have 5 children, and 14 grandchildren. And we got a whole mixture of males and females, and and they're all growing up. And so I think if there's one message I'd like to leave you with, is number one, we are in the world of gender-specific medicine, whether we want to recognize it. And there's still an old medical system that doesn't recognize that. And I encourage everybody. I mean, my vision for years has been a medical clinic where you walk in if you happen to be in a couple or not, and you walk in, and if you're a guy, you go one direction, and you get some guy medicine, and if you're a woman, you go and you get women medicine, and then you come together, because there's a lot of what guy medicine does that women need to know about, right? Women need to know, man, forget about it. You don't need to remember it for 20 years. You don't need to ruminate. That, there's some things it's good to forget. And guys gotta, know, hey, there's some benefit to remembering maybe where the pot goes is not important, or at least the pot that goes in the drawer with the other cooking utensils. But there are things that are important to remember. So I think we got a lot to enjoy with each other that we haven't enjoyed as much as we might have, and we got a lot of things that we can learn and teach each other. So that's my talk. We have time for comments, questions,
Jake, can you talk a little bit more about mental depression, because I some of the things you talk about as far as anger, irritability, those things that so oftentimes in men that get frustrated in life, we go through life, and just because we're guys,
Right.
we do this kind of thing, not even knowing why.
Right.
But it can be at any age. It isn't necessarily at midlife or later. It's,
Right.
in your 20s you're going through.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've seen, but not just always just testosterone. It was just puffed up, but it may not have been. Maybe you've really been depressed at that age too.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, because clearly not every time you get pissed means you're depressed.
Right.
And just getting angry, anger, there's circuits in the brain that, that trigger whenever we feel threatened. But what distinguishes between, short-term anger, which is good, where you got a threat and you deal with it, and this kind of irritability. I'll talk personally. The way Carlin describes it in me, she said you get that beady-eyed look. I said, what are you talking about? You understand? And the jaw gets, this kind of thing, and it goes on. It isn't just a one-shot deal. It often isn't related to things that go on, and it becomes chronic. And it often covers over, I would talk to friends, a few friends, because men often don't talk to their friends, and that's part of why when we get depressed, it all runs around in our mind. And so it starts coming out as blame, like I would say to her sometimes, well, of course I'm angry. Who wouldn't be angry if you were doing what you're doing to me? And she'd go, what? I'm just loving you. Yeah, but you're doing it in a really, that kind of thing. So it's that. And what's really interesting, they have a diagnostic and statistical manual for all these diseases, which I think is a waste of time. But in the manuals, the irritability was a symptom of depression in adolescence, male and female. But when you get to be adult, it dropped out. So irritability was no longer a symptom. And I wrote a book called The Irritable Male Syndrome, Understanding and Managing the 4 Key Causes of Aggression and Depression. So that's what you need to look for, with depression is, that feeling of just my world, I don't feel good. It's a feeling of unhappiness that often expresses itself. The way my summary of it is that men tend to act out their depression. And we're talking generalities, right? There's individual there. And women tend to turn it in. Yeah.
How do you treat depression?
How do we treat depression? Good question. All kinds of ways. The first way is you got to recognize it. You got to understand, that you're depressed. My father never got treated because nobody got that he was depressed until he tried to kill himself. Okay. So, early diagnosis, and there's now I've developed a questionnaire that I think is a lot more male friendly. So one way for men is I've developed this, it's out in the world and hopefully people will use it. Once you've gotten some treatment, some diagnosis, then you got to get treatment. And I'll tell you again, a personal story. Carlin recognized that I was depressed before I did, not uncommon, and she suggested I go to see a doctor. And I said, I hate to tell you this, but I did say it, I can't be depressed because I took the depression questionnaire and I didn't show depressed. And besides, I'm a professional. Don't you think I know if I were depressed? There's a lot of professionals, right, that don't get it. So I finally went to a doctor, and the doctor, did some things, diagnosed me, said he wanted to treat me, and I said, I want a second opinion. So I came home, and Carlin said, you want a second opinion? Let me give you a second opinion, Jed. You better get some. So I went to another doctor. Went to a second doctor. So I got diagnosed. Okay. And then the treatments, there's a lot of treatment depending on the person. There's medications, There's psychotherapy, which I've done all of these things. So therapy, relationship counseling, exercise, changing a diet. You know, I found, that a lot of getting a good night's sleep. You know, a lot of people who haven't slept for a long time, that adds to depression. Treating other, illnesses can help. So there's a range of treatments, all of which can be helpful to the right person. The first two, you gotta know you have it, and you gotta reach out for help. Those are the first two things you gotta do.
Is there a part of the brain or what percentage of our upbringing, our family patterns play into our personality? What I'm thinking about is the ability to adapt to another person, learn things. Are there some differences there too?
Gender differences or
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, in the way I think about this, there's no difference between environmental factors and genetic factors. We know now new genetic. It used to be we thought whatever you got genetically. Like when I was in school, the belief around depression as an example and all other these things was that if your father had it or I had it all through my family. So the view was I'm genetically more likely. It's just programmed into my brain, and I'm more likely now to get depressed because it's. But now we know that genetics interacts with the environment, with your upbringing, with your beliefs. I grew up with a mother that said, I'm so afraid you're going to end up like your father. I'm so afraid you're going to end up like your father. Well, right, you start having a mindset or a belief that says, I'm going to get depressed like my father. And then, we know, for instance, and this is true, and it probably has less to do with genetics, but sensitivity is that we know a lot of creative people. This is the upside of depression and bipolar, is that creative people often are more likely to get depressed. And we know, you study artists, painters, writers, higher levels of suicide than the general population. And some of that is, I think, we just are more sensitive, right? We feel more strongly, when there's pain, we feel it more strongly. And in some ways, if we don't know how to handle it or we haven't learned, the skills of dealing with the ups and downs of life, then it affects us. And the difference with men, and this is a real critical difference, is that there are three factors that influence, I think, why men are more likely to commit suicide. One is that we know that it's a simple concept, but it's profound, is that if we're disconnected from people, we're more likely to get depressed. And there have been all kinds of studies that show if we're in social connection, if you have friends, if you have things that you believe in. And men tend, particularly as we get older, so this is where those two graphs overlap, the suicide rate for men as we get older. Men, compared to women, tend more as we get older to lose friends. So, old buddies that we used to have drop by the wayside, they just move away. And secondly, we don't replenish them like women do. Women start out with a larger group of friendships, generally, social relationships, and men. We're more isolated. Men often have maybe one friend, two friends, and maybe the woman in our life. And if things aren't going well with the woman in our life, we're friendless, many of us. So, number one is we lose social connection. Secondly is that men have a tendency, different than women, to feel that we're failures if we don't achieve certain levels of doing well by our roles. So, that was my father, the role of provider. We all have roles, and they're all important, but men often attach more of our identity to the role, so that when my father felt he couldn't support his family, that meant I'm no good, I'm not worthy. women don't quite have that, that belief about themselves that if I don't live up to this standard, then I'm no good. They have other challenges. Women have other challenges. And then the third thing is that men generally tend to have available and use more lethal means of, men are more comfortable with guns. And that's obvious, but a deeper truth is that to kill yourself, to actually kill yourself, you have to, have a belief that says, it's a painful thought even. But men, and again, trained from the time we're little to live with pain. To go, it's manly, whether you're in sports as a young boy. I grew up with this, you play hurt. And so when you have that mindset that says you play hurt, you deal with hurt, it's more easy, again, generally, for a man to say, I can do this. I can picture taking a gun and putting it to my head. Or I can picture taking an overdose of pills. I can see myself. Where women, it's a more repugnant, that final step. So we know that women often, have suicide attempts. And I'd suggest that most of the women that I, see, they're in pain, absolutely. Women that try to kill it, take it seriously. This isn't, some people say, well, they're just looking for attention, or they're just, no, it's serious. But I believe that most women who attempt suicide didn't want to die. And there's reasons why, the people that don't die. It isn't just that they made a mistake and they didn't die. And men as a group are more comfortable with the pain of dying. That's a third thing. So what that translates to is for any of us, socially isolated men, you got a guy in your world that is isolated, doesn't have any friends, that's a risk factor. Irritable anger, that's a risk factor. So I tell people, if you're a guy, don't let your friendships go. As you get older, you got to make new friends. You got to read, you got to be in a men's group. You got to, do some things that keep you connected, otherwise you're at risk. Yeah,
I'm just curious, it just occurred to my mind that maybe it's also related to what you shared before, that men have this solution-oriented, that they have that more dominant in their brains.
Yeah.
So suicide is a solution.
It's a solution,
and
absolutely.
Women are more the worriers, so they
Right.
are probably more worrying about what about my kids, what about
Right.
my husband, what
Yeah.
about my friends,
Yeah,
blah, blah,
that's
blah.
right.
So maybe that in itself,
Exactly.
this difference in itself might.
Yep, no, that's
play-
good, absolutely good point. Yeah, they worry more, they're more socially
Yeah.
connected, so they're going to worry about their family. The men that I interact with that are, really highly suicidal, either don't have social connections, or they've come to believe that their family would be better off without them. I'm just a source of pain, I can't do anything, they'd be better off if I weren't here. That's,
Plus they don't worry about the mess.
they don't worry about, yeah. The cleanup, hey, that's somebody else, please.
Would you comment on generational and ethnic differences? For example, my partner's father, who's German, and generations older than us, they didn't believe in psychotherapy.
Right.
They didn't believe in depression.
Right.
The guy was very depressed.
Right.
I mean, you could see it from the outside.
Yeah.
And then some of the young people also who have sort of inherited this earth and that have sort of a very
Yeah.
black perspective on things.
The general things that I'm saying is worldwide, men tend to commit suicide at higher rates than females. The only place that it doesn't hold up is in some parts of China, where that's a different story. But there are social differences, there are generational differences, as you point out. Clearly, we live in a generation that is both more sensitive to things like depression. When my father tried to commit suicide, it was taboo. You didn't talk about it. For years, people asked me, "Where's your father?" And for a while I'd say, "Well, he was in a hospital. He was sick." And no, not depressed. And then after a while, if anybody pressed me, I'd just say, well, he's gone. He's not here. And then finally said, he died. That was a simpler way to not deal with the reality.
Of course, you were very young.
I was very young, but then as I got older, as a kid, it was just, I don't want to deal with that. And I was lucky, like I said, I got to a point where, at a time where depression is more talked about, there are more people. I remember the thing that kind of, in addition to Carlin, is that I read a book by a colleague who I knew, who had been doing high-level study on manic depressive illness and bipolar. She was a woman doctor and taught at MIT, was like at the top, and she wrote a memoir called An Unquiet Mind. And I read that and I went, wow, if she can talk about, her illness, well, maybe it's not such a stigma. So I think that's part of what's changed. We all know somebody, and there are people in sports that are coming out and talking about their depression, and there are people in other kind of high level where we go, yeah, well, maybe it's okay that I can come out. But even so, men as a group still have a hard time talking about it. So, part of why I wanted to come share with you is obviously as I talk about it, other people are going to go, well, maybe if Jed can talk about it, then I can talk about it, and we can all, help each other. Not just with depression, but all the other secrets that we hold.
Following up on your statement that cells are gender specific, I was just curious about what happens when you're looking at a blood transfusion or any kind of donor, organ kind of thing. Is there ever any thought that could be an issue, or is it?
Probably those kind of things are not, they're generally, maybe.
Surgeries are successful, so.
Yeah, so things like that would get noticed real quick,
Yeah.
but the problem is that a lot of these questions haven't been asked, and like the David Page at MIT, for instance, a lot of the research that's done on stem cells and, the early cells, and you go into a laboratory and you get, you're working on cells, and he says, are they female cells or male cells? And they didn't know, because they don't sex the cells. So even like the basic research, they're coming up with things you don't know is the thing. All these drugs that we're taking, I think this is a good example and something we can all take responsibility for, is that, we don't know. There may be some drugs that men are overdosing on because they affect us stronger than women. So what I do, I try to take as few drugs as I can get away with, and if I am prescribed drugs, I tell the doctor I want the lowest possible dose you can give me, and then I'll see how it goes, and then up it, rather than, well, here's the prescription, I'm supposed to do it this way. And we shouldn't have to, and we won't. As more of these studies are coming out, they're going to know, like Ambien, that we now know, generally women are going to, if you take the standard dose. So now Ambien is the only drug that I know of that if you go to a doctor, you're going to get a sex-specific dose. No other drug, they haven't done that with others. They've had some TV things where they've interviewed and said, well, should we go back? And the Federal Drug Administration says, there's so many, we could never, it would be billions of dollars, might save some lives, but basically they're not going to do it. They'll do it with new drugs now, they'll, hopefully, but who knows. But yeah, it's something that we all need to, like we all need to do while you're here, and take responsibility for our own health, prevent rather than wait till you get something. And here's another thing just to be aware of, and you all have the handout which gives you just some of the major points that I want you to have, and it's got contact information. If this is interesting to you, you can either email me, or if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer, or I have a website. You can have a newsletter that's free that I post all kinds of articles about all these issues that I find interesting. So again, thank you all for coming on this election day, and I hope this has been of interest and helpful to you.